International news now.
Now we're going to sort of move away from the speech at the UN, and we're going to turn to this, a story that showcases this grand strategy of Donald Trump and his administration in action, right? And that is this renegotiation of NAFTA, now the USMCA, right? On Sunday night at the 11th hour, negotiators for the United States and Canada reached an agreement to include Canada in a renegotiated free trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And there was a real fear here that an agreement with Canada would not be reached, and this would have severely damaged supply chains for all sorts of products made in North America. And let me just take a sidebar here and make a quick note about what I mean when we talk about supply chains. Supply chains are involved in many products such as automobiles that have parts that are made in a variety of locations around the world. And these parts are transported to other locations where they are then assembled into the final product. And this creates a complicated matrix of relationships and logistics to get parts that are made all around the world sometimes to where they need to go on time and at a competitive price to be finally assembled. Right? And so changes in international trade rules, such as new tariff or trade barriers like tariffs, can disrupt these intricate supply chains. And if Canada would not have been included in this new trade deal with the United States and Mexico, its products would have faced new trade barriers that would have disrupted the production of things like automobiles all over North America, because parts of those automobiles are made in Canada and then transported into the US or other places to be finally assembled, or parts are made in Mexico and transported to Canada to be finally assembled, right? And so that's what we mean when we say that, you know, the failure to get a deal would have really disrupted these economies. And so this agreement that was just reached over this past weekend is a good example of the Trump administration's approach to trade and international relations in general, right? And so we're going to start here with a clip from CBS News that summarizes this trade deal. So let's roll that clip.
The president today hailed a new trade deal worked out with Canada and Mexico. He campaigned on getting rid of the North American Free Trade Agreement, saying it's cost the U.S. jobs. So NAFTA is now the USMCA. Weijia Jiang is traveling with the president in Tennessee.
It's a brand new deal. It's not NAFTA redone.
President Trump took a victory lap in the White House Rose Garden, celebrating a trade deal to replace NAFTA, called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. The president had been at odds with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau until the deal was finalized last night.
A lot of stories came out about Justin and I having difficulty together, and we did over the trade deal. But I'll tell you, it's turned out to be a very, very good deal for both.
Canada has agreed to lift restrictions on its dairy market so U.S. farmers can export products more easily. But the biggest impact is on the automobile industry. In order to avoid tariffs, the deal requires 75% of a car's component parts to be manufactured in North America, up from NAFTA's 62.5%. It also requires that at least 30% of the work on a car be completed by employees earning $16 an hour or more.
Workers in the U.S. and Canada generally make more than $16 an hour when they're working on a car. Those in Mexico, much less. And that has encouraged a lot of manufacturers to move those jobs to Mexico. This new iteration is meant to bring those jobs back.
CBS News business analyst Jill Schlesinger says that could create new costs.
Consumers could pay more for a car.
But first, Congress has to sign off.
Anything you submit to Congress is trouble, no matter what.
Well, this new agreement is a campaign promise fulfilled by President Trump, who's expected to turn it into a big talking point as he hits the trail again for the midterm election starting at this packed rally tonight here in Tennessee. Jeff, he says he officially expects to sign the deal in November.
So let me make a few points here. First, there we go. First, NAFTA was a key test of Trump's strategy to negotiate bad trade deals. This is important, right? He can say this was a political victory and this was delivering on a campaign promise. The other thing is Trump successfully used American economic leverage here to execute a change in important trade deal. Part of his critique is the United States has long been the most powerful economy in the world. Why is the U.S. making all these concessions on economic policy to the rest of the world? Right. We're surrendering negotiating and bargaining power. We shouldn't be doing that. And so in this case, Trump successfully used American leverage to renegotiate NAFTA. And if we think about this in raw aggregate terms, in 2016, U.S. GDP, or gross domestic product, was over $18 trillion. Canada's GDP was about $1.5 trillion. Mexico's was about $1.05 trillion.
So roughly 18 times larger.
Yeah. Right?
In each of its partners.
And yet both countries export around $330 billion of goods and services annually to the United States. In other words, these two economies can't afford to be shut out of the American economy because it would be much more difficult for them to find new places to export their products. This means the U.S. had a lot of negotiating leverage, and Trump's point is, why should we be surrendering this? They need to give us a better deal because they need our markets more than we need their markets.
So it goes to that famous line of his, trade wars are easy to win. That's what, that's the approach he uses. He threatened Canada, basically. Yeah.
So he negotiated hard and signaled that he was willing to leave Canada out, which, as we said, would have greatly damaged its economy. But it's important to point out this would also have harmed U.S. firms. And so we get this deal reached at the 11th hour, right before the deadline set by Trump. Now, the deal favors certain key actors in the United States, like auto workers, that are a crucial component of Trump's electoral coalition. This is why he's framing this as a campaign promise kept, and this is widely seen as a major victory for Trump. And if we think about auto workers, again, remember the nature of that coalition that secured Trump's victory in 2016. This was about Wisconsin,
right.
Michigan, and Pennsylvania, upper Midwest. And so auto workers are key.
McDonald country.
Yeah, McDonald country. This is Moser country too, right? So what he's saying is, I delivered for the people that helped me secure victory in 2016. Now, if I can have fact checkers check me on this as well, I also think that Canada was not allowed to get concessions on the steel tariffs in this.
Yeah,
double checking this. Why is this significant? That's Pennsylvania, right? So there are important domestic electoral considerations at play here as well. This will be played up in the campaign in the summer of 2020.
So on the steel tariffs, what Trump and Trudeau said is that's just going to be handled on a separate track, right? And so they just left it out. You can't deal with everything at once. But yeah, there's an electoral component to that. So let's just talk about the basics here of the new USMCA agreement.
Did you hear he wanted it left as USMC?
To as a nod to the Marine Corps.
Yeah, but they wouldn't let him do that.
They didn't do that, no. So it's no longer NAFTA. People shouldn't call it NAFTA. It's a brand new agreement, USMCA, right? So that's one of the big changes. He insisted on it, new name, right? And so it's the USMCA stands for the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement. So to say it's the USMCA agreement is kind of redundant because A stands for agreement. Anyway, so what does this agreement do? So first of all, there was a necessary update to this. NAFTA was brokered before the internet revolution really took hold, and so this agreement modernizes that previous agreement and includes things like e-commerce and other high-tech and technically infused trade that was just not existing really in any large scale previously when the first agreement was made. Perhaps most importantly, as we've already talked about a bit, there's new rules for automakers. And these new rules are specifically that a higher percentage of auto parts need to be made in North America. It rises from 62.5% of auto parts to 75% of auto parts, and that should help all the three economies and the auto industry in all three economies, Canada, US, and Mexico, because there'll be more production here in North America rather than Asia or somewhere else. It also, importantly, raises the wages for auto workers. And how they do this is that there's a requirement that by 2023, 40% of car parts must be made by workers who make $16 an hour or more. And they start in 2020 with 30% of car parts, and then they raise it to 40% after a few years. Now, these new rules could increase U.S. auto manufacturing jobs, all right, because auto workers already make more than $16 an hour in both the United States and Canada, but they make much less than $16 an hour in Mexico. And so that rule is designed to kind of shift manufacturing jobs up to the more advanced economies. But this could backfire, and there has been a little bit of debate on this because it does mean higher costs for North American cars. And those higher costs could be passed on to the consumer, and they might just pay it, or consumers might opt for cheaper cars that come from other parts of the world, and that North American cars, because of this rule change, might be at a disadvantage on cost, right? So other changes. There's more access, and this was a big talking point for Donald Trump, more access for American farmers, dairy farmers, to Canada's dairy market. And so he got that concession from Canada. But Canada also got something. It retained what's called the Chapter 19 dispute resolution mechanism, which allows each member of this trade pact to challenge laws and rules of other partners in the pact. And so that was an important concession to Canada. That was a very big sticking point for Trudeau. And so they hammered that out. Also in this deal is improved environmental, labor, and intellectual property protections. And these are very important for, especially the United States, the intellectual property part of it. The environmental and labor protections are mostly targeted toward Mexico, and increasing their environmental and labor regulations so that they more closely match the standards in the United States and Mexico. So it will help the United States and Canada, but it will do a little bit of damage to the competitiveness of Mexico in this relationship. And finally, there needs to be noted that there are frequent reviews to this deal. Every 6 years they review the agreement, and there's a sunset clause that this agreement just ceases to exist after 16 years unless it's renewed. And so those are the big challenges. Now, one of the things to note here is that Congress remains a big hurdle that needs to be overcome to finalize this. It is not guaranteed that Congress will approve this deal. President Trump seems to acknowledge that in the clip that we just saw. Particularly, this might get dicey if Democrats win back one or both of the houses of the legislature. And it's going to be complicated for Democrats. I mean, there's a certain part of the Democratic Party that's going to love this renegotiated pact, but it was Donald Trump's signature thing, and partisanship might just get in to block a win for Donald Trump.
What's your bet? Does Congress sign off on it?
I think so, yeah. I think it will. I mean, it's kind of like the TPP. I mean, the only reason that the TPP went away was because of presidential politics, not congressional. Obama struck a deal with some Democrats and a bunch of the Republican Party to pass that trade deal. I think he'll do this. I mean, Donald Trump could do the same with the Republican Party and members of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I suspect he'll get a deal. It won't. Well, I mean, we'll wait and see. But I think it will be tough for Democrats to oppose the Republican Party is the composition of the Republican Party is going to change with this election. A lot of establishment Republicans are resigning. They're not going to be in Congress after the 2018 election. So the party is going to look more like the Trump version of the party. And so they're going to back him on this trade. And so I think, and the Republicans aren't going to want to deny him a key trade policy win. I suspect he gets enough Democrats.
I do think they're going to try, though, to squeeze something out of him. I mean, if they have some leverage here, he's going to want this thing to pass too. And so if they can squeeze out something on DACA or anything, they're going to try. But whether they can actually stay together is probably doubtful. Let's talk just briefly, we got just a couple minutes, on economic winners and then economic losers. And the big winners, as we already talked about, I would say is Trump and Trudeau. They both salvaged a deal, right? Auto workers, dairy farmers. But the key loser, I would say, is consumers. I mean, this means higher prices on a lot of goods. Any other losers, you think? Winners?
No, I think that's what we'll be focused on in terms of the narrative about this trade deal, at least over the next couple of weeks.
And it's crucial to acknowledge that consumers are going to bear the cost of this. And that's just, again, speaks to how trade and the politics of trade works. The least organized group here is consumers. And so, of course, they're going to be easily, targeted as the one to bear the cost there.